Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Bruna Ferreira da Silva Calado will defend the academic thesis, Re-victimization and False Memory Formation. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis?
Dear Director, the assessment committee, dear supervisors, dear family, dear friends and colleagues. In the next few minutes, I will present to you a brief overview of my PhD thesis entitled Re-victimization and False Memory Formation. I'd like to start by telling you that re-victimization is the condition of being victimized more than one time. So when a person has been sexually abused 3 times, we can say that this person has been re-victimized. And that false memory is the term used for a variety of memory errors that can include distortions of details in a real event, but also the creation of a memory of an entire autobiographical event that never took place. The context that my thesis comes from is the context also as an example that happens in the satanic panic in the 80s, which was a collective hysteria that happened in the US, in which thousands of people believed to have been sexually abused by their parents and school staff. There were always bizarre elements in these people's statements that included ritualistic satanic ritualistic elements, and that's why the name comes from it. But also magical elements like flying in broomsticks and some other magical elements, particularly in the children's statements. During this time, we had really very important high-profile cases. And it was interesting that even though the victims at the time never really thought they could have been sexually abused by their parents or by the staff, many of them thought that perhaps they just lost their memory based on the concept of repressed memories. Meredith Maran was one of those victims at the time. She never once thought that she could have been sexually abused by her father. However, she was assisting some other journalists in archiving some of the cases that were happening during this period. And to explain the rough relationship that she had with her father, she decided to seek help to try to understand whether the depression that she had and the struggles that she had could be explained by this, this finding that everybody was having at the time, that they had been sexually abused, and this would explain many things in their current lives. So she was recommended to see a therapist that was specialized in therapy for incest survivors. And with time, she came to form rich false memories of being sexually abused by her father. Later on, she did realize, and she wrote a book about it, saying that the memories that she formed were indeed false because of the way that they came. So as scientific studies arise, people could start to perceive how the quality of the memories that they had. And because they never once had thought that they could have been abused, and they suddenly started to be led during the therapeutic sessions to think about possible occasions and really be guided by the therapist to imagine themselves in the traumatic experiences, those imaginations are starting to mix up with the belief that had happened and consequently forming a false memory. But in those cases are not a relic from the past. In my thesis, in the second chapter, we have thoroughly analyzed the Jakarta International School case, which is a case that happened in Indonesia in 2014. This case shocked many experts around the world because of the many problems that it had, but particularly relevant for my studies. The children in this case suffered an enormous amount of suggestion, and they were really led to come from denials of being sexually abused by the school staff to then really graphic statements of sexual abuse. In total, the children accused 8 members of the school staff of sexually abusing them repeated times within the school settings. The way that it started was really led by the parents, who were very worried that the children could be sexually abused in the school because they had found out that a former staff was a pedophile. So we had a similar context of a hysteria happening in that small community. And from 1 child, we went to 2 children, and then from 2 to 3 children accusing the school staff. So in this table, we can see that the children really had a lot of exposure to suggestions from external sources. And even though they denied that any abuse had happened, the parents and the adults in the investigation, and they really wanted to help the children disclose, and they thought they were helping the children to disclose. So then the children underwent This number show one of the children that went over 50 sessions of psychotherapy in which hypnotherapy was used, which are similar techniques used by therapists in the 80s in trying to restate the context of the potential abuse and make the children like imagine possible situations. Furthermore, the police did not use techniques that are known to be part of best practice for interviewing children, because they never really allowed the children to explain with their own words what would have happened to them. And in fact, they have, whenever the children denied, they would just continue pressing and insisting for the children until the children came to disclose. Some of the children were actually punished at home when they would lie. And the parents came forward to the media to say, I punish my child at home when they lie. So hence, when he tells me that he has not been sexually abused in school, I punish him physically. But when he does tell me the truth, that he has been sexually abused, then I make him his favorite cake. So it's a good example to show us the dynamics of how it happened for the children to come from denials into disclosing the sexual abuse. The children, that they can read what the adults want from them. This scene is an example of how the interviews went and also how the reconstructions of the crime went. We can see here the mother leading the child. In this footage, she's truly pointing like to places and was it here, was it that? And the child was just like nodding along to whatever she suggested that had happened. So after months of investigation and continuous exposure, the children came to claim some very peculiar things. For example, that there was a magic stone retrieved from thin air that was used during the sexual abuse occasions to numb them, that they got fed magic blue potion by the headmistress of the school, and that there were secret rooms that the investigation could never find, but also that they were assaulted during school hours in the students' bathrooms and also in the teacher's office, which is quite strange because the school had an open plane. So most of the walls were glassed, and when not, was really just an open playroom. And even if the abuse had happened inside the bathroom, which is a private ambiance, then somebody could have possibly heard, because the claims is that the abuse took place during school hours. So the case lasted for about a year. And even though there wasn't a single witness to the case to support the claims of the children, there was no traces of DNA, and there were also not physical signs of sexual abuse in the children, even though they were repeatedly exposed to child sexual abuse examination, which is quite invasive and can be quite traumatizing for them as well. And by analyzing the people that were accused in the case, they got convicted. Part of them were convicted to 7 to 8 years in prison in the end of 2014, so almost after a year that the case had started, and the other part were convicted in the 2nd of April 2015 to 10 years in prison. And by analyzing the gist case carefully, we concluded that children's statements were rendered unreliable, and they suffered a lot of contamination. So it was very difficult to attest for the quality of the children's statements. And looking back at Maran's case, that she suffered similar influences, it could have also been that the children in the gist case also formed false memories for traumatic experiences in school. So to look into the possibility of people forming false memories for victimization, so to being, for example, sexually abused repeatedly, in my last chapter, so chapter 5 of my thesis, we look into the possible conditions for this. So because of this high-profile cases, we looked how people could form false memories in this specific way of repeated events, and we came from studies that mostly started to arise during the Satanic Panic as well, and since the many issues that we had with suggestibility, but also with false memory formation. And they started to study some elements of this. In 1995, scientists, they were able to implant a false memory of a unique event, so an event that happened only one time, in 25% of the sample. And after that point, the literature in the implantation of false memory for autobiographical events grew a lot. And then we had many studies investigating different ingredients that would facilitate the process of implanting a false memory of an autobiographical event, because then we can understand cases like Meredith Maran's better. But then, of course, one important aspect was missing in this case is for us to be able to relate to those high-profile cases that we saw in this presentation. Those studies, they focus solely on the implantation of a single event, and then critics of the literature came forward and say, well, then I think it's very well that the literature has advanced in many ways, but we can't completely use it to explain what happens in those cases, since in Meredith Maron's case, in the GIST case, and many high-profile cases in the 80s, children and adults had formed false memories of re-victimization and not of a single event. And is it even possible then for people to form false memories for repeated events, or are actually those repressed memories that are being recovered? So then to see whether we could implant false memories for repeated events, we had 3 groups. In the first group, we used the standard method that had been used before, which is implanting false memories for a single event. In our second group, we implanted false memories for repeated events. And in the third group, we also implanted false memories for repeated events, but then we tried to make our participants more familiar with the idea of the false event that we wanted to implant. So we, instead of telling them from the beginning that they had been sexually abused repeatedly, sorry, not sexually abused repeatedly, we did not implant this event, but that they had suffered the false narrative that we were trying to implant repeatedly, we just simply told them that they had gone through that narrative. And then in the second and third encounter, we increased the frequency. So the procedure went like this. We had 3 interviews that were spaced by one another by a week. And in each one of them, we would tell our participants stories about their lives. And embedded in that would have our false narrative, which was to lose an elephant plush toy as a child, be very upset about it, and cry. And after 3 sessions, during the 3 sessions, we would use techniques used in psychotherapy contexts. For example, in hypnotherapy, they tell people to be very calm and just try to guide them with their imagination to try to remember the things that they couldn't. So if a participant said, oh, I can't remember losing this toy, then we'll ask them to close their eyes and ask them to try to imagine themselves holding the toy and the texture of the toy and being very upset about it and talking to the parents. In the last interview, we would debrief our participants and told them the true intent of our study. And it was quite interesting because even telling them that for some of them that did form false memories, that the false narrative never happened, some of them was difficult for some of them to let go. They actually did believe that then we were lying to them, but they actually had the elephant toy and then cried and been upset about it. So our results show that despite being often debated, it is possible to form false memories for repeated autobiographical events. And then in fact, our results indicate that it might be easier to implant false memories of repeated events than false memories for single events. We had higher rates of false memories in our repeated groups than we did to the standard group in which we implanted false memory for a single event. So even with very artificial conditions, it is scary to see that people could form false memories for repeated events. So they came only for 15 minutes, once a week for 3 weeks max, and we were already able to collect memory statements from them saying that they had false memories for the event that we were trying to implant. And it's important to understand these mechanisms, and this finding is extremely relevant to understanding cases and assisting cases like the GIST case and also Maron's case. Important also as in a personal level, because knowing how to assist this, we can educate protectionists, and then we can avoid people from actually having traumatic experiences from something that never happened to them, and also avoiding the imprisonment of innocent people. So the relevance of my thesis lies from the studies in this presentation, particularly with the false memory implantation study. It adds a lot to the field of false memory implantation because it's the first of its kind implanting false memories for repeated events, and also analyzing thoroughly a recent case of potential false memory formation for repeated events is very important for us to see that those cases are a relic from the past, and even though they only represent a very small portion of the cases of sexual abuse that come to the legal system, they can be extremely detrimental. I thank you for your attention, and I pass the word back to the prorector.
Sorry, first time. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Corinne de Ruiter, who is a professor of forensic psychology at our university.
Thank you, Mrs. Prorector. Dear candidates, first of all, I would like to congratulate you and your supervisory team on a well-written thesis that contains a large variety of studies using different research methodologies and also a large variety of samples. And a case study, of course. But foremost, I appreciate not only the research methodology, but also the societal relevance of your work. As you know, I think that's important. And I hope that because you start with a case study from Jakarta's international school, that hopefully will increase the reader's curiosity to read the remainder of your thesis, because I think it's highly relevant for practitioners. I would like to ask you some questions about chapter 4. In this study, you assess people's beliefs about the credibility of statements about sexual abuse, experience, sexual abuse, victimization. One group that's particularly relevant, of course, and you included them in your study, are the actors in the legal arena, such as police officers and judges. And in table 3, you show the justifications the different legal professionals provide for their credibility ratings. And it's mainly, the non-credibility that you're assessing here. Now, it is hopeful that the most prominent reason provided by a large number of these legal people is that the level of detail in the statements is something they think is really important, which is proven by empirical research, of course. However, and this is very concerning, is that the third most often mentioned justification is that repeated accounts of sexual abuse are less credible. Now, this is interesting in view of the theme of your thesis, of course. And also, and I don't think you mentioned that in your thesis, but I mean, we know that most sexual abuse occurs within the family, with non-strangers, and a lot of sexual abuse is repeated abuse. So this is highly worrisome. It's the people that actually, deal with these cases think that repeated abuse is not very likely. And in your discussion on this chapter, you rightfully acknowledge that these people are actually blaming the victims. They're saying, I don't know if this is true because you're saying you should have done something, you should have walked away. Well, of course, it's not possible if your father or your next door neighbor is the perpetrator. So your statement, making practitioners of the legal system aware of this potential bias, this victim blaming bias, could ensure more sensitive and equal treatment of sexual abuse victims in the criminal justice system. Yes, this is a nice, statement, but it's easier written up than done. So my first question is, could you elaborate on your ideas on how we are going to stop this victim blaming bias? It's part of our society, but it's also part of our legal system. And what are your ideas about, decreasing this prominent problem?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your compliments, and thank you for your wonderful question. Yes, I also very much like the applied aspect of this study, and I thought it was extremely elucidative to have practitioners of the legal field to see what would happen there. We have some better ideas sometimes based on social media and how people can react to some posts, for example, in the Me Too context. But then it's quite interesting to see what the actual practitioners that are there right now are thinking about topics like this. I was a little disappointed, I must say, of course. But well, first of all, indeed, it wasn't strange to see that they found repeated sexual abuse to be less likely than single sexual abuse. And this is aligns with the literature just on statements overall. People in general apparently find it more believable when somebody is telling them their memory about a unique event versus the event that happened repeatedly. And it's also interesting in a way because it doesn't necessarily align, for instance, with what happened in the gist. So there was no witnesses. The children said that they were sexually abused repeatedly, and people did say that the prosecution went ahead with it. The court convicted the people that were accused. So it's quite interesting to see that. And I would say that, going straight into your question about how we can bring more awareness to practitioners about it, I would say that policy perhaps is one of the best ways that we have. also as a female, living my whole life in certain daring ambiances sometimes, that there was a lot of like challenges in my home country because it's an extremely sexist country, then I can say that it's difficult for you to indeed just say, hey, we have to improve this, when you also yourself very often also have the same values and reproduce those values without questioning it. So I think that we are going through a systemic change at the moment, in which aligns very much with equality in many ways. And of course, that we know that the majority of the victims of sexual abuse are females. I wonder how those results would look like if we had male victims instead. But I would say that the best way for us to start is really trying to train practitioners, like a lot of you already do, and going to the conferences and presenting our work in a way that we can have a dialogue and can have a conversation and can actually make people think. But I think ultimately we have to hold hands with policymaking. And without that, it's going to be very difficult to try to actually implement a change, because changing a cultural aspect can take generations and generations. And this is very ingrained in our cultural aspects, not only in Brazil, but we saw we had quite a variety of professionals from different countries in the study. And we saw that those results, they were just pretty much uniform across them.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But I mean, you're actually suggesting that things are getting better. But I'm really worried. I mean, think about what's happening in the United States right now with the right of women to have an abortion. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying. Well, I'd like to hear from you what your idea is about. I mean, how can we bring facts to society?
Highly esteemed opponent. Thank you for your follow-up question. Oh, this is so heated. Yes, I think we have to go with the flow of communication that's happening right now. We have to be on social media. We have to dialogue with people. We have to talk to somebody in the line of a coffee. It's only really by sharing ideas and talking and trying to join these important conversations. For example, what's happening in the US right now. But I would like to say that in hindsight, in Argentina, things are walking towards freedom of women's uterus and their own choices about abortion. And in Brazil, is slowly, not with the current government, but we have hopes for the next government that these dialogues are also going to improve. And you can already see that in the general mindset of people, they are just open now to at least have this conversation, when 10 years ago was impossible. And you have all the religious values also attached to things like this, right? So I think I'm afraid I don't have a very structured idea on how to change the world, and and especially now in this aspect, I very much would like to see it. And by everything that I try to do, these are values that I try to bring forward, because without this small little change, the little ant work really little by little is going to be impossible. But I think that doing our research is something, but we have to get this research out there. Something very important to me that I will say about Brazilians' reality is that in Brazil, the university is based on 3 pillars: research, teaching, and extension, which is getting really an extension of the university out there in the community. So you just don't go out there, you collect the data, and you never come back, you return something to them. Mm-hmm. So I think this is something that is interesting for all the universities around the world to have as an example. Far from me to just say that everything is wonderful in Brazil, it's not. But this one aspect is important, particularly in countries that have such strong sexism happening, for example, particularly for this case. It's important for us to just get this out there and not just put it in a shelf later on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor de Ruiter. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Amina Memmon, who is a professor of psychology of the Royal Holloway University of London.
Good morning, candidate. It was a great pleasure to read your thesis and hear you saying how important it is for you to get the research out there. And echoing what we've already heard, I think I really appreciated the mixed approach that you took, starting with the case study and then engaging in some empirical, theoretically motivated data collection, and then concluding with what the impact of your work is and how you can give back what you've learned. So thank you for that. I think it's really important to have that focus on disseminating So I'm going to ask you some questions about chapter 2 and 3. So in chapter 2, you've described the case study that you've already presented with us. And my comment comes from page 48, where one of the recommendations you make on the top of that page under, it's the 4th point, children should be formally interviewed as soon as possible after suspicions arise. And the interview should be video recorded. And we do video record our interviews in the UK. It's one of the kind of recommendations. But isn't there what we would call a double-edged sword here? Because if you video record and credibility is being assessed, is there not a danger that practitioners, experts also might rely on non-verbal cues to assess credibility? Is there a problem there?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and thank you for your question. That's a very interesting point. I think that, well, coming from the precarious reality that I had back in my home country and during my studies, that I did have opportunity to be in some interviews and also to assist children who had been sexually abused, I would say that when there is a lack of appropriate training for the interviewer, recording can be a protection for the integrity of that interview. So we had a situation in which basically the interviewer was extremely biased to believe that the sexual the aggressor of the child had been her father, and in actuality had been a neighbor. And it was difficult for us to be able to assess the quality of what was written, because there was somebody writing down, but we didn't see how the child was behaving, how the child felt in it. So the child had already given before a statement saying that it was not the father, but the interview wasn't neutral to it. So then in that particular moment, I remember, and I was like fresh 3rd year in my bachelor's, I had no clue of what would be appropriate practice, because Brazil is extremely precarious in this point. And I remember this was the first thing that occurred to me. Why were we not recording this to be able to see how the child behaved, and also to actually have verbatim whatever the child was saying? So I see your point about perhaps someone else watching later on, when you do have an appropriate interview, like trained for it, and then perhaps somebody has a different impression, and then how we're going to come up in the end with something uniform. But I do believe it's important to have the interviews recorded, because then if something happens, we have that material that to be able to be assessed by someone else.
Yeah. And in addition to that, we can also monitor the quality of training. So if we are moving towards that model, at least we have a record. It's very useful for experts like myself to be able to see. Thank you for that. So I'm now going to turn to your chapter 3, where you did a really interesting study asking whether children make better witnesses than adolescents. So you had 11 to 12-year-olds, and then you had adolescents. So if you want to turn to page 66, I've got 2 questions from that page. The first one is where you present your results, and you find that 11 to 12-year-olds, you comment, are in a stage of their life where perhaps their social connections are beginning to form, and so they might be more susceptible to what I would call memory conformity or social influence from their peers than the adolescents. So can you suggest some circumstances where that might differ, or where your results might have differed, if depending on who the confederates or where the social influence came from? I'm thinking in particular of the New York jogger case, where we had these 5 young boys that confessed to a crime that they'd never participated in. They were friends. There was a motivation that they had, which had consequences.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your second question. Yes, I do believe that there's something very interesting about this paradigm, which is having someone who is like you. So we are careful to have the same age, to have a similar background for this confederate, so that they can relate, and we actually see how peers influence is going to play a role, which was relevant, for example, in the GIS case, in which the children did exchange a lot of information to one another. But yeah, I would say that if there is an older developmental group, with a child, with an adolescent, it might be that they will look up to them in a different way, and then the influence takes over because of this authority position, because of, you know, the influence will then just change. So I would say that if if wasn't a Confederate, but then the researcher wearing the white blazer or something, really like having elements, social elements of passing some sort of security or some sort of authority over them, then I think indeed we would have had different results. But also perhaps we know that with parents is also already a completely different story. So then the diets, they can like yield different results in terms of influence, in my opinion, based on indeed who is the one misinforming the child, for example.
Candidate, you've actually gone beyond what I was asking you, so that's a very good, thorough answer to my questions. You've touched on other issues like confirmation bias and the impact of authority figures. So it's a very complex area, and there are numerous other things, as you said, you could have looked at. So on the same page, just one final question. You know, you talk about some of the mechanisms, and you're comparing spontaneous false memories mechanisms with looking at the formation of memories where external processes such as social influence influence the formation. So are these mechanisms exactly not the same for true memories? What are the differences between the sort of processes underlying the formation of true memories and false memories? And are we not really looking at the same mechanisms here? It's just a comment, really.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your third question. Yes, that's a very interesting question. I think that, yeah, I think the processes are similar indeed. And when you look into the theoretical, the frameworks that help us to understand, for example, script and other theories that just completely disappeared the name from my mind right now. We can see that our ideas, especially when you're an adult, you have more information in your head, and consequently things tend to attach to those networks of information into your memory. So indeed, when you put a person inside an MRI machine and you're looking to ask them to imagine something, to remember something, very similar areas in the brain are activated. And this is also why it's difficult for us to assess memory sometimes, because basically what we have is the memory statement. We can't really, what is a memory to measure, right? So this is a difficult point. And then I would say that there are indeed very similar processes of forming false memories from forming true memories when it comes to spontaneous false memories specifically. Yeah. But with all the types of false memories, and it's actually unfortunate that we have the same name for everything. I think there is a way that we can assess how that memory came to rise, which can assist cases for us to understand, oh, this is a true memory, or is it not, or is it a false memory, for example. But by reading a list specifically in the DRM paradigm, then we can see that by similarity of the words, then we have the lure, we have the thematical words coming through, and that's indeed, we didn't read that, but that's forming by the same kind of stimulus that you're having. I think that's the way that I would reply to this question. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very clear.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Peter Mures, who is a professor of developmental psychopathology at our university.
Dear candidate, this morning I was looking in my schedule and I saw there is a defense, Bruna Calado. Yes, that's you. But I was confused. I went to the university. I was looking in my postbox. I didn't find the thesis, so I had to prepare the question. But I understood later on that there were problems with the thesis. Well, the least I can say, the publisher did a good job. It's really nice. It's also a great idea to have a hardcover of the thesis, because it really looks like a book, and it's the color is the cover is really nice. I really like it. So compliments for this. Also compliments for your work, and also compliments to the promotion team, of course, because you did a good job. I also have to admit that I was looking at your propositions, and there was a proposition by J.K. Rowling: happiness can be found even in the darkest of times if one only remembers to turn on the light. Yes, and I was thinking of you, and I thought, is this personal or what is it? Because in the years that I've known you, you were always making such a happy impression on me. So I don't know whether this is a false memory installed by your rabbit statement on the front pages. On one of the first pages, you make a statement. I think it's a dedication to thank people, but there is also a reference to a rabbit there. Yes, okay, maybe you can explain later. But the false memory then, that came to my mind, but maybe it's not a false memory, but maybe you can help me with this first, is about that I suddenly thought back of an event. It was Carnival, I think 3-4 years ago, that I saw you in a rabbit suit dancing to a drum band. Can that be correctly? Were you in the Carnival or were you not?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments on the book. Apologies for the delay, and thank you for your question. To answer briefly, I never wore a rabbit costume in my life. I did have a dragon costume, so perhaps it was me, but in a dragon costume. So maybe you did have a false memory. Once you read rabbit,
Okay. Okay.
you turned that
But
the
you were
dragon
dancing
to a
to the
rabbit.
drum band, is that correct?
Potentially.
Okay, okay, yeah. Okay, so it's a partial.
Yes, I
false
think
memory.
I just have this information kind of
Okay.
paradigm false memory.
Okay, but let's ask also a serious question. And the serious question is about chapter 4, which is about, and Professor De Ruiter was also talking about this, about the practitioner's justification of the credibility of the stories that you gave to your participants. And well, I'm on the board. I'm on the committee that judges on. Well, it's a committee for unwanted behavior. So the University of Maastricht is together with Open University and Hogeschool Zuid. They have this committee where they handle cases in which, for example, a student says this teacher or this staff member, well, he went over the edge. He made some comments about me, some sexually harassment issues. That kind of stuff is on the. And the last time we were having the case, it was a couple of months ago. Well, we were really in doubt because the female student, she said things that the staff member, the teacher, really said some things that, according to us, that went over the edge, certainly. So that was not the case. But the guy, he kind of, well, said, no, it didn't happen. And then, well, it made me think of when I read your thesis, and especially this chapter, how difficult it is to decide then what is true and what is not true. And so you don't want to, you want to go along with the person, with the victim in this case, but you also don't want to accuse a teacher, a staff member, because it didn't happen. We were really in doubt. So, and well, the chapter, you said something like, and I'm going to that page, it's in the discussion, which I found a little bit shallow. This is also the paper that has not been published so far. So I think the reviewers will tell you to go into deep a little bit more. You write in that on page 84, you write that it certainly seems alarming that 10 out of 11 categories that emerge from the statements of the practitioner's sample in our study indicated a reliance on stereotypes of victims' behavior rather than research-based accounts of victims how they tend to behave. And so from your answer to Professor De Ruiter, I understand that the details make a difference. Is that true? So if you would advise us as a committee when we have another case, what should we pay attention to then? What are the characteristics of, well, a statement that might be true? So can you help me a little bit with that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I cannot. Certainly details are not important. And that's why I was yeah, was upsetting to see the results and the justification. It's interesting when you just have a quantitative study and you just ask somebody to do to point out in a scale what is the grade that they're giving versus actually why did you go in this direction then? Why did you find this statement more believable than the other one? And yeah, the details should not matter. The stage in which a victim that has been sexually harassed can be varied. It will depend on who this person is, how they took it. Sometimes they give a lot of examples. Sometimes they will be extremely practical about it, and they say everything that happened in a very calm way. And that also bothers people, especially if it's a female. You have to cry, you have to look in this way or in that way. So there's always little ways of finding a way to blame the victim for whatever reason. And this could again be ingrained in our sexist values to some extent. But I also think that the most important thing, I think it's very nice that you are in this board, and it's a great opportunity to practice something within the university itself, because yeah, we know that these things can happen in any environment. And the only advice that I can give to you is just not have any preconceptions when you go to listen to the story. Just try to really see whether there are corroborations, perhaps somebody that could have seen something, see whether there's something else that put the pieces of the puzzle together, but do never make an assumption on how a victim has to behave. This doesn't exist, in my opinion.
Okay, so your advice would then be to take these things into account and to pay attention to that you don't go into the trap.
Yeah,
easily.
pretty much. Yeah,
Okay.
it's really trying to find is the recipe of how a victim of sexual harassment is to provide a statement is the trap that we fall into.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Carolina Lunde, who is present online. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Gothenburg.
Can you hear me all right? Good. So dear candidate, thank you for the opportunity to read this highly relevant work of yours. I have two questions. And the first one, or both of them actually, concerns chapter 4, or study 4 perhaps. So this is about the credibility of statements about re-victimization, sexual abuse happening once or repeatedly. And I was kind of missing from reading the introduction of the 4th chapter. I was kind of missing the arguments for the direction of effects for the hypothesis. So the hypothesis were that repeated sexual abuse would be rated as less credible, and children would also be perceived as less credible than adults telling about sexual abuse. So could you please provide me with your strongest arguments for the hypothesized direction of effects, because you did in fact not find support for all of them?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your question and thank you for joining us today from so far away. I would say that for the first part of the question, that is related to why we hypothesize that statements for repeated events will be seen as less credible. So that was particularly based on the literature for people narrating that something happened to them repeated times versus single times, just everyday life events, just neutral somehow events. We didn't find anything in the literature. So to our knowledge, this was the first study actually using like a statement of proper child sexual abuse and also adult sexual abuse. So we didn't really know whether they were like having the stimulus, having the materials actually about sexual abuse would make a difference. And of course, it was more interesting for us to look into these materials than just general events again. But then our predictions came for this hypothesis specifically on the previous literature that said that whenever a person is reporting something repeatedly, they are perceived as less credible when then they are saying this happened to me one time and it was a unique event. So this was for the first hypothesis. And then the other hypothesis that you asked was about why children will be perceived as less reliable. We also have some evidence in the literature that says that when compared to an adult, children tend to be perceived as less credible, and it could be simply because they are attributed to have a bad memory, or that they can't really provide a reliable statement because of the developmental characteristics. So those are basically the two ideas behind those hypotheses.
Right. So that kind of leads me into another question, and that has to do with, so can you really generalize the, because I get it that you can't find support for your hypothesis from previous literature focusing on repeated situations of sexual abuse, but considering that the scenarios was about 5 to 8-year-old children telling about sexual abuse, so can you really generalize the literature focusing on other events such as taste, food, right? What was it? Food. They were the repeated events that you were writing about in this chapter had to do with other things than sexual abuse. So I would be thinking that maybe if a child told about sexual abuse, since this is not part of normal situations for children, that might have been perceived as more credible, actually, the opposite direction.
Indeed, we couldn't generalize precisely because of the difference, but we had to start somewhere, and that's why we made the predictions like this. But then in the end, we saw, luckily, that there wasn't a difference between the way that our whole sample, so the general public, the law students, and also the practitioners assessed the statements in terms of the different age, and when they reported it, there was no big difference between them, no significant difference between them. But yeah, we had to start somewhere, and that's why we chose to do it like this.
Yes, I understand. Okay, so still focusing on chapter 4. So this is 2 questions disguised as one, perhaps. You write in the as your conclusion, you write that our experiment shows the victims who suffer sexual abuse victimization are more likely to have their credibility jeopardized, re-victimization then. So could you, based on so this is the 2 questions disguised as one. Could you please tell me more about the procedure when you developed the specific scenarios used in the study? So how did you choose your, the vignettes and the content of them? And could you also please convince me that this, based on the scenarios used, convince me that this conclusion is correct?
Esteemed opponents, thank you for your second question. I will try my best. Yes, so the way that I did it was to really dive into as many reports of sexual abuse that I could possibly read within a month. So I read different statements from different countries that I could find, that I could put my hands on, that I could either translate or could just be in English, of course, in Portuguese and Spanish, and languages that I could understand. And they had a lot of similarities, and those similarities, then I started to do like a small analysis of the content just for myself, and then I started to rise the most important points. So every single one that I read, and of course the majority of them were females, and that's why we definitely chose the victims for all the groups to be assessed to be females. And usually also those cases, actually some majority of the ones that I read spoke about re-victimization, and especially with children, and usually by somebody who is close to them. So I didn't want to necessarily use somebody in the family in the study, just to perhaps not shock so much the general public audience, because we know that some sorts of text can be difficult to be read, and I just wanted to give the idea in those statements that it was somebody close to them, like most of the cases that I had read, but I didn't necessarily want to include somebody in the family for ethical reasons. And Yeah, so another elements that we had, which is like really in everyday life, because a lot of people have also the conception that it has to happen in a very out of the ordinary place. And we also wanted to bring ambience that was just really in the everyday life of the adults and the children of the victims. And this was also based on these cases that I've read and the statements that I read. And of course, we had to be concise. So it would have been great to write something thorough. It would have been great to have an actor just really doing a video and saying the statement. But then we also knew that if we did it like this, there could be many other variables going on. And then that's also why we chose to just have a story, a vignette of it written down for people to read. And we also tried to control for the number of words between the single statement, the single event statement versus the repeated event statement. So then we would avoid problems like, oh, there's more words here, there's more information here, hence this is more credible. But then of course it's difficult because then when you're talking about victimization, you have to tell the instances of it. But this is basically how it came, those statements were made. And I don't remember your second question. Could you please remind me?
I understand. So you could, if I were like the devil's advocate here, you could say that you did assess the credibility of those vignettes or those situations that you described in the vignettes. So for example, a 5 to 8-year-old going alone on a bus multiple times being raped by the bus driver and dragged into a construction site. So that's one of the scenarios. So you could say that maybe you assess the credibility of that scenario instead of the credibility of being victimized. So that's why I wanted you to convince me that the conclusion that you draw from the study
To
is
answer
right.
in one sentence,
Yes.
yes, because we need to go to the final opponent.
I'll try my best. So I understand what you're saying. I think that this is an important point, but then most important than the what happened in the event itself is whatever the victim is saying. And I think that if people assess it less credible because of the environment, and we did get this justification, that's not an excuse to assess in such a way, because there are certain social classes in which children, for example, do take the bus by themselves, and they have to do a lot of things on their own, and they don't have all the protection that in some other social classes they would have. So everything is really possible to happen.
Thank you.
No, you did very good. So the opposition will be continued by Dr. Anna Sagana, who's an assistant professor at our university.
Dear candidate, please accept my compliments as well for your wonderful work here. It's highly relevant and very interesting to read. I have 2 questions for you today. I'll try to keep it short. So my first question has to do with the ethical considerations of this type of work, of false memory work in general, in the era of the Me Too movement. So you make a very strong plea today, and you devote a great part of your discussion on disseminating the findings and this work to practitioners, officers, more specifically, and legal practitioners. So I would like to challenge a little bit the need for this work, or maybe at this time. So basically, have you considered the repercussions of going about and doing this? In Michael Salter's words, and I know this might raise some red flags to your, yeah, I can see it already, to your supervising team, the original success of the false memory advocates is because they were skilled at retelling a story of child abuse as a drama. So, but that has heroes, the people who were falsely accused, and villains, the therapists who produced these false memories. And the battle was between good science in this storytelling idea and forces of darkness like fantasy, dogma, and hysteria. And I might disagree on many other things with this particular individual, but I do agree with him that it's a very strong story to tell. So aren't you afraid that, or concerned that law officers might bite a bit too much on this story and start disregarding victims more often than they should, for various reasons? First of all, because, as you say in chapter 4, they already have their pre-existing beliefs. Second of all, because they might misjudge the frequency of false memories due to availability heuristic, or maybe because skilled lawyers might use it for defense. And we have the recent example of the lawyers of Weinstein, who actually got Elizabeth Loftus to testify in defense of Weinstein, basically arguing, not arguing, but explaining that false memories can be formed and hinting to the possibility that some of these allegations were the result of false memories. So I would like to hear your thoughts on the matter. How should we proceed given this background? How can we disseminate our findings in a way that won't backfire?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your excellent question. Yes, so this is something that I've thought throughout my studies, and I think when I started my PhD, the Me Too movement was starting to boom, but I was always very careful to use that anything that I've done or written as context for what was happening, because in my opinion, the Me Too represents a movement in which we are coming from. First of all, we're coming from sexual abuse that has happened, let's say, more recently, and in a more, let's say, plausible way in terms of like hierarchical relationships and power relationships. And we started to have some sort of cathartic release of a lot of victims that would withhold at some point and be like, I'm not going to say that this happened to me because nobody's going to believe me because that guy's amazing and look all the wonderful things that he does, and I'm a nobody. Nobody's going to believe in what I'm saying. So I was always very careful to see. I was also very curious to see what the movement would lead us to. And I think that it is very important to do these studies. And I do say this in my thesis, that the cases like the GIS case, like Maron's case, they are a small proportion within the sexual abuse cases. And when we don't address and we don't understand and we do not develop research and seeing the mechanisms of how these memories come to arise, then it's actually difficult for us to not take away the credibility of the real cases. And that has already happened. We already know that people are familiarized with the term of false memories many times, especially in the US, when they had all the hysteria happening in the 80s. So I think this is already out there in a way. And I think we ought to continue indeed to refine even more the research that we have, so we can speak properly about certain mechanisms, so we can also speak to the truth of some cases. And particularly, I would say that, no, I would just end because we have a second question.
Thank you. So you would go about explaining these findings in relevance of the mechanisms and not to the percentage of power often.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Thank you. And then my next question regards chapter 3. And chapter 3, you used both a DRM paradigm and a conformity paradigm to find different pattern of results, if I am correct, like the developmental reversal on the one, but not on the other. And yet you conclude that spontaneous false memories and false memories induced by suggestion are formed in different ways, although the two instruments are not correlated, and this is totally in line with earlier findings, you also say. And I wonder, what would it take to conclude that these two measurements, these two tools, tap on completely different constructs, on different effects, one of which might not be false memory? And so what would be the findings should be to conclude that? And also, if you can comment briefly on whether it reflects on the very broad definition that we're using about false memory.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your follow-up question. Indeed, I think it's very important for us to be able to give different names for the different distortions that happen in memory, precisely to understand that they probably arise from different mechanisms. So when you talk about the memory conformity paradigm, we know that the memories arise likely because of influence. So we have a social element here of being suggested by somebody else.
But if I may interrupt you,
yes.
Would it be that one of this is not a memory thing? It's not a false memory. It's
absolutely. I was going
different.
to get that in my next sentence. And then when we talk about influence, and especially like suggesting the memory post, it could just be that the children wanted to look cool and say exactly what their confederate had said before. So.
You can briefly finish your answer, one sentence again.
So yeah, so I do believe they arise in a different way because also spontaneous false memories are more attached to the knowledge that a person already has. There's no external suggestion, it's only your own knowledge. And when you have some other misinformation, then we're talking about external suggestion. And then there are other elements that will play a role, social roles specifically. And then is it even a false memory or is it just a report, just really saying along with whatever the Confederate said as well?
Thank you. Bruna Ferreira da Silva Calado, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. Okay, welcome. Bruna Ferreira da Silva Calado, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications. The degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Otkar is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I do promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Bruna Ferreira da Silva Calado, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Bruna, first of all, let me congratulate you on an excellent defense and writing an excellent thesis. I have been your co-supervisor sort of remotely at the University of Gothenburg, but we've kept an active text chain for quite a while. We've worked closely together over the last few years, and as your journey toward your PhD comes to a close, I think it's natural for a supervisor to reflect back on the supervisory relationship and to really appreciate the uniqueness that every supervisory relationship has. And one thing for which I'm incredibly grateful is the massive good fortune that we've had to work together. And by good fortune, I mean that I didn't choose you as a student. I was asked if I would come aboard this project. You didn't choose me as a supervisor, and yet we seem to mesh quite well. We work quite well together, and I think our personalities are interestingly compatible, especially given the gulf of difference that we have and the many disagreements that we've had over the years. And yet, I think we are so very similar in many ways, and those are things for which I'm very grateful. We are, the both of us, as we were talking last night at dinner, it occurred to me, we are both of us very much the products of education. in each of our respective ways, particularly the products of public education, which is interesting. We owe our education a great deal, including where we are. And I mean that both metaphorically and literally geographically. The both of us come from very far away and find ourselves here. And what great fortune that is, that the common pursuit of knowledge, that way of engaging with the human condition has seen fit to bring us together. And that is, I think, a wonderful thing. And it also, in thinking about that, made me reflect on another part of you that I so greatly admire. It is the part of you that is reflected in particularly in small things in my experience as your supervisor. For example, you'll notice, those of you who have read Bruna's thesis, that she opens her thesis with a quote from Oscar Wilde, a choice that I massively approved of. And I think choices like that reflect your engagement with the full spectrum of the human condition. You are an excellent scientist because not only because you are an expert of your field and you've demonstrated your expertise in the area of memory and in legal psychology through an excellent thesis. You're not only an excellent scientist because of that, but you're an excellent scientist because science is a fundamentally human activity and you engage with the full breadth of human experience. You talk fluently when we've had conversations about art and about literature as fluently as you speak about science, and that is a beautiful thing. It reflects an earnestness and a sincerity, a deep curiosity, and a sincere pursuit of education, not just formal education, but a real pursuit of knowledge. And that comes through in other ways. And it has led to interactions that we've had where we've disagreed quite openly. I don't think we've ever fought. We've kept it civil, but our disagreements are sometimes lively, and that is a wonderful part of the scientific process. It's a wonderful part of the supervisory experience for me, and I think one part of our supervisory relationship that I've really appreciated is that I think, if I'm not overinterpreting, that your sincerity and earnestness in your education has equipped you with a sharp ability to say what you need when you need it, and I've always appreciated that. It's the way that I, as a supervisor, have learned from you. For example, I'm quite notorious. Those of you who know me already know that I'm quite notorious for leaving a lot of comments on drafts of writing. And you humbled me once by telling me that my comments were unclear. And that, I think, requires a bit of gumption. And no, this is a compliment, I promise. It requires not only courage to stand up to an ostensible authority, but also an understanding of yourself and what you need and what you would benefit from. And I learned something in that moment about how I could improve, and that's more than any teacher could ask for. So when I say that you are an excellent scientist, I mean that in the full definition of what that means. Congratulations. What a privilege it has been to work with you these last few years. I'm so proud of you. This is a little gift from your colleagues and friends at Gothenburg.
Dear Dr. Ferreira da Silva Calado, also on behalf of the Board of Deans, I congratulate you with the honor you have acquired. I would also like the opportunity to thank our guests present here and also the guests wherever I have to look online. And I would now like to invite the audience to go to the reception area we will remain here to give the guests online a chance to congratulate you and to take some pictures, and we will be there in 5 minutes. I hereby close this academic session.